A couple of weeks ago, I wrote about seeing an old man on the garage roof of my childhood family home in Manchester. After that rather harrowing encounter, I never saw him again, and I never dreamt about him again, or even really thought about him. I did have another experience in the same house a couple of years later, which frightened me even more. This one stayed with me from the night it happened as a 9-year-old all the way into adulthood. I still think about it regularly, not just because it genuinely shook me to my core, but also because I wasn't the only one to experience it in the house. As a child, I was very adventurous in my outlook towards fear and thrill seeking. I'd watch every horror film I could get my hands on. I'd read the scariest novels in my parents' library. I throw myself willingly at anything that might have a chance of scaring me. Nothing ever really came close though. Once I got into the upper ages of primary school, I started going out with my friends more and staying out later. My parents were very relaxed with my curfew. They knew me well enough to know I'd never put myself in danger or get into any trouble, so I was generally allowed to stay out a lot later than the other kids in my group who had to be home around 7 PM. The park we used to hang around at was further from my house than anyone else's. One night, I impulsively decided to take a different, longer route home that led me past a cemetery. It was the same cemetery that a few of my relatives were buried in, so I was pretty comfortable being there. I stopped to look at the black gates guarding the entrance. They were huge, easily 3 times my height, and were in pretty poor condition. It must have been years since they were painted, or had the rust scraped off them. The gates were covered in moss, and the spikes mounting them had pierced an assortment of different coloured leaves, and spider webs covered the tips of them, with threads connecting each spike. I wanted to go in. I don't know why, but something felt as though it was pulling me in. The gates were barred shut in the evenings, so my only way in was to climb. I eventually talked myself into doing it. I was more worried about someone seeing me do it than any danger that might befall me while attempting to get over them. I was a fairly athletic kid, so getting over was no issue, and I was certain I hadn't been seen, even though my weight made the gates rattle loudly and violently. Once I was inside the cemetery, I just walked around, reading the names and ages of the people buried there, taking in when they were born and when they died. Like most cemeteries, the newer plots were at the front, so I started heading deeper to find the older graves. I must have been walking for about 20 minutes when I saw a very unique looking headstone. It was about 10 foot tall and was shaped like an angel holding a baby with young children standing beside her. The faces that had been carved into the stone had been weathered away, leaving them featureless. They were eerie to look at in those surroundings, and with the sun having long since set. There was no noise, except the rustling of the trees and the occasional sound of a car driving past the entrance. I knelt at the grave and tried to make out the name on them. There were 3, and they'd been dead for a long time. The name at the top of the list, which I refused to say, was clearly the mother, given her age. The other 2 were younger children. The elder of the 2 had died at the age of 8, while the younger had only lived for a year. The dates of their deaths were the same. All 3 had passed away at the same time. As a 9-year-old, I understood how odd that was, but not that it could have unlikely meant they died in a tragic accident or in a murder-suicide. While I was observing the gravestone, I heard a branch snap in the distance behind me. I immediately jolted around and began scanning to see what had caused it. It was tough to see, but I couldn't make anything out. While my back was turned on the grave, the hairs on my neck tingled like someone had blown on them. It was enough to tell me I shouldn't be there and I needed to leave. I ran towards the exit and scaled the gates without worrying how much noise I was making. Once I was over them, I began making my way home. Occasionally, I glanced back into the cemetery through the cast iron bars. I was being followed, I'm sure of it. The graveyard was pitch black, but I could still make out the silhouette of a person walking alongside me, but much deeper in. I quickened my pace, but the shape kept up, and now it looked closer than before, like it was walking closer towards me, but also still moving sideways. I ran across the road without looking. A car had to slam its brakes to avoid hitting me. The driver beeped the horn, but I paid her no attention. I was only thinking about getting home as quickly as possible, and I ran the rest of the way. By the time I got home, it was pretty late. My mum told me to get washed up and go straight to bed. I did as I was told. I wanted to put my time in the graveyard behind me and move on to a new day. While I was asleep, I kept dreaming about the cemetery and the silhouette that had moved alongside me. Then I dreamt about the silhouette walking through the streets of my neighbourhood and heading straight for my house. In the dream, the silhouette headed straight into my house, up the stairs, and to my bedroom. I woke from the dream and stared at the ceiling. I could see a small amount of light coming through my door. It was ajar. I never slept with my door open, and once shut, it was impossible for the door to open without turning the handle. My room was deathly silent as usual, but I could hear someone walking around in the infinite darkness. I peeked through the gap in the railings of my bed and could see the silhouette standing by my wardrobe. I shut my eyes and tried to regain my composure. I could hear it moving around. The noise stopped, and the usual silence of my room at night returned briefly. It was broken by the sound of my bunk bed steps groaning under the weight of someone climbing up them. I heard the first step, then the second, and then the third. I opened my eyes to look and saw the shape looking back in my direction from the top of the steps. For a split second I was transfixed. It wasn't a silhouette though anymore. It was a woman wearing a black dress with a veil covering her face. Her face had no features, just like the headstone I'd stopped to look at in the cemetery. Even without eyes, I could tell she was looking at me. I threw the covers over my head and hoped that would be enough to hide from her. It wasn't. I felt her weight shift from the steps onto the bed itself. I felt her edging closer towards me. I could feel the weight of her on top of me. It was suffocating, crushing. She moved in the most unnatural way possible, more like a snake than a human. She was shifting up the bed and closer to my face until she stopped. I knew her face and mine were now level. I shut my eyes again and told myself no matter what happened, I would not open them. My covers were pulled away and I could feel her breath on me. It was odourless and cold, like the breeze that squeezes under a closed door. After what felt like an eternity had passed, I couldn't keep my eyes closed anymore. I opened them and looked at her. She wasn't featureless now. I could see her. I could see her old, freckled skin, her pointed nose and thin lips. Her eyes were closed so tightly they looked sealed shut. Only a second had passed before I let out the biggest scream I had ever managed in my life. I wanted to wake up every person on my street if possible. The woman slithered away without making a sound, without even opening her eyes. I heard my parents' door open and the steps of my bed creaking. My mum and dad burst through the door and flicked my light on. As my eyes struggled to adjust, I could only make out the silhouettes of my parents and the woman. She walked right past them without them noticing. They spent the rest of the night reassuring me that it wasn't real. My dad took me back to my room after I'd started to calm down. I stepped in and saw a mudded footprint on my carpet. I pointed it out to my dad and he could see it too. I could see it on his face. He was uneasy about it. He suggested I stayed in their room. Eventually, I managed to fall back asleep. The next day, my parents agreed to swap our rooms around. I never experienced anything paranormal in that house again, and we moved about 2 years later. I know my dad will have convinced my mum to swap the rooms. I didn't find out why until 3 years ago, when my dad passed away. In the evening of his funeral, me and my family stayed up talking about our lives together. My mum mentioned what happened that night, and I told everyone who didn't already know the story. When I finished it, my younger sister, who wasn't alive at the time this happened to me, and my mum shared a look. I asked them what it was for, and my mum told me that my dad had seen something almost identical to my experience. The same woman, The same feeling of her crawling towards him on the bed and just staring at him. He didn't tell me because he didn't want to frighten me more about the whole thing, and once we'd moved and time had gone by, it was no longer something to even talk about. According to my mum, he'd seen the woman wandering around the house many times after that night. My mum believes in the paranormal, but has never experienced anything herself, but she always said me and my dad were very receptive to things like this. The woman has haunted my dreams so many times over the years, and even now, despite the fact I lived hundreds of miles away from that home, there are times where I feel like she's still watching me. There are times where I can see a silhouette on the other side of the road, only when I turn my head, there's nothing, or no one. To this day, I'm convinced that woman haunted my dad, and is still doing the same to me.